for arranging this. So when Matt offered me the opportunity to talk, and I saw his email, and he said the theme is about connections and barriers, my mind went in many directions. So I'm going to begin with the end in mind and share with you where I want to go with this. And my theme is find the connections to remove the barrier. There might be one person up here that you recognize, the other people I'm sure you don't. And so what I want to do is I want to get into a little bit of philosophy, and then I want to make a connection by sharing my concept with the stories that I'm going to tell you. Totally separate stories about three people, and hopefully I can do that for you today. Often when I'm with people throughout the district and we're talking about various topics pertaining to curriculum, program, and instruction, this word comes into play. And I'm not doing very well with the technology so far, am I? Here we go. So synergy is a word that we use often, and you may not be able to see it, so I'll read it to you. The quote by Helen Keller is, "Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much." And I feel that the visual at play here really represents synergy. So you have these three different cogs, I guess I'll call them, and they're connecting with each other. And when people come together, they share ideas, they listen, and sometimes they're really wanting to have their idea be the one that is selected. But with synergy, it's not always one idea or the other idea, but a third alternative. And to get to that alternative, I want to share some thoughts with you by Peter Senge. He's the author of The Fifth Discipline. Senge says, on the topic of openness, there are two pieces to it. The first piece is called participative. And with participative openness, what it simply is about is the willingness, the comfort level to talk, to share with people. That's the easy part. And he says you can't have complete openness unless you have the second part. And that is called reflective openness, which is on the bottom here. And so with reflective openness, he says, you can't do it unless you perform two key skills. And the skills are to inquire, and then the second skill is to engage in dialogue. So think about that. With participative, anybody can talk at people, and I think we do that a lot. We talk at people. But do we do the second part, which is to inquire, to ask questions, and to seek to understand? And to do so, you have to have dialogue. And so I want to share this concept with you as I tell the stories, because here's my belief. My belief is that openness knocks down barriers, and when you knock down the barrier, you can create connections. And most importantly, going even deeper, when you create connections, you have what we all want. And that's choices. If you have an iPhone, can you hold it up? Why don't you take a look around? I'm not asking you to do it to silence your phone, but just take a look around. Let's go backwards and learn a little bit about how some of this came to be, shall we? This is Paul Jobs. He's holding his adopted son, Steve. Steve Jobs' parents were Clara and Paul Jobs. Paul, the father, was born in Wisconsin. He was a Coast Guard seaman. He moved the family west in the 60s to the Silicon Valley, south of San Francisco, in the Santa Clara, San Jose area. He worked in electronics. He did a lot of work with lasers. And his son, Steve, when he was born and growing up, he had some difficulties. He resisted authority when he was in school. He wasn't making connections in school, and he had barriers. He got into some trouble. He was suspended a few times. Sadly, when he was in junior high, middle school, in 6th grade, 7th grade, he was bullied. And he didn't like that. Who would? And he was bullied so much that he said to his parents, listen, I want to go to a different school. And to do that, they needed to move. He convinced his parents to sell their house and to buy another house in another district called the Cupertino Sunnyvale School District. And when he went there, he was trying to find his way, and he was by himself a lot. And he was kind of at that point where, what do I want to pursue? He was a junior, and he was thinking he liked literature a lot, but he also liked working with things with his hands. He made a connection. He practiced openness with this gentleman. This is his electronics teacher, his junior year in high school, John McCollum. McCollum says that Steve Jobs would often be in a corner off doing something by himself, and he just let him be. And I thought to myself, genius on the part of John McCollum. He recognized, honored, and valued that he had a student who simply needed to be alone. And he let him tinker and do what he wanted to do. And so Jobs was by himself a lot trying to create. But what's interesting is, on the concept of openness, he couldn't just do that alone in order to move forward. He had to practice the concept of dialogue and inquiry. And he did that with a person he met in high school. These are some of his classmates. That's his teacher on the far left. That person was Stephen Wozniak on the far left. You probably know the story about Steve Jobs, but Stephen Wozniak was his partner. They would work in the garage at Jobs' house, at Wozniak's house. They would get all kinds of materials, electronic devices, and they created the Apple II computer. Together they found an Apple. And there's Jobs on the bottom right, later in his career. You know the rest of the story. You have the devices, you have the technology, and you know what it does for you. This is an interesting quote. I believe it applies to what we're talking about today. Creativity is just connecting things. Interesting. Let's go to another story. I have an interest in running. I like distance running in particular. I believe the best distance runner in our country's history is Bill Rogers. Let's learn a little bit about Bill Rogers and what he was all about. That's Bill on the far right. It's his brother in the center, his friend Jason. They called themselves the Three Musketeers. They were buddies. They grew up in Newington, Connecticut. And they would spend their time running in the woods and hiking and doing things that kids do at a young age and having a lot of fun. Well, as Rogers reflects on his youth, he says he's pretty sure he had attention deficit disorder. He couldn't sit still. He had a hard time in school. He needed to move. He needed to release energy, and that's just what he did. His favorite activity, this is interesting, he would take a broomstick and attach to it a pillowcase. And there was a big, large field near his house in Connecticut, and he would chase butterflies. And he said he was really good at catching butterflies. So picture Bill Rogers running around as a kid, 10-year-old, catching butterflies. And people started to realize he's pretty fast. He's pretty quick. So he started to run more seriously. So much, in fact, that when he went to college, he decided to run on the cross-country team at Wesleyan College. That's him in the center of the picture. Second from the right, the gentleman with the glasses and the singlet on is his teammate. His name was Andy Burfoot. You probably don't know that name, but during the winter of 67, 68, they were roommates at Wesleyan. And Burfoot decided to go further than the typical distances a college cross-country runner would run, which would be in the areas for a race about 6 miles, but training certainly sometimes longer and mostly right around that ballpark, and a little shorter too, depending on where you were, right? So he decided to go further, and he wanted to train for a marathon, the Boston Marathon, April of 1968. He trained so hard that he was running long distances on the weekend, 10-mile runs on Saturdays, 20 or more on Sundays. And he told his roommate, Bill, get up and join me. And he said, I can't do that. I can't. He said, I want to sleep in. He'd get up a little bit and catch him at the tail end. But guess what happened? Burfoot, so dedicated to the cause, he ended up winning the race. How about that? April 1968, a college athlete. He had to still do his studies and all that. He was in college full time. He wins the Boston Marathon. Unbelievable story. 1968, Andy Burfoot. So Rogers, going forward, you know what? He decided, maybe I can do that too. But when he went to run, he needed to be harnessed. He needed to be taught strategies. There are tactics to running long distance. You can't just take off or you'll fade as the race continues. He met this gentleman on the far left, Bill Squires, not a household name, but the coach of the Greater Boston Track Club. That's his ragtag group on the bottom. They trained at the track at Boston College in Newton, Massachusetts. In the early 80s, 6 of the top 10 runners at the Boston Marathon were all from his group. Every American that finished in the top 10, I believe it was 1983, were coached by Bill Squires. And he coached Bill Rogers, and he taught him how to harness the energy and to run with tactics and strategy. After many failed attempts at distance running, Rogers started to listen. He made a connection with the coach, with the teammates. They paced each other, they learned from each other. Take a look at the results, not bad. He won the Boston Marathon 4 times, 75, 78, 79, and 80. Only one person has done that since, and he won the New York City Marathon 4 years in a row from 76 to 79. Nobody has won the New York City Marathon 4 years in a row since that time. I'm a baseball fan, you probably picked up on that. Been around me. Hey, guess what? Trivia question. Who was the starting shortstop for the St. Louis Cardinals in 1951? Give up? The answer is right there. Soli Hemus. Who in the world is Soli Hemus, Mr. Cox? Why would you be telling us about this? Here's the story. There's a backstory to this. It's not how it was supposed to be. In this photo in the front row, there's a gentleman named Ed Natofsky. On the last day of spring training at the Cardinals spring training camp in Florida, the manager came up and he said, "We're breaking for St. Louis tomorrow. You're the starting shortstop. You're breaking camp and going north with us." He was elated. He's going to the big leagues. Had his bag. He went to the train station. Everybody's getting on the train, right? Changed plans. Came up to Natofsky and he said, "No, we're not going to do that. We're going to send you to AAA Rochester instead. Farm Club, my hometown, Rochester, New York." Guess what? I'm not a Cardinals fan, but in my judgment, that was the best personnel player move the St. Louis Cardinals have ever made. I'll tell you why. Because Natofsky continued to play in the minor leagues and never got called up to the majors. Soli Hemus remained the shortstop. He later on managed the Cardinals. Natofsky played out the string in the minors, but then he made a shift. And he went back and he received his teaching certificate. He became a theology teacher, athletic director, basketball and baseball coach at Cardinal Mooney High School in 1962. I met him 7 years later as a 9-year-old at his basketball camp. One of the most powerful individuals I've ever met because he inspired people and he made connections. He built people up. He was amazing at it. He impacted thousands of students in a 30-plus year teaching career. I'm proud to stand here today and say I was one of those people. But I had some barriers of my own when I was in school growing up. I was very shy. I spent my time playing basketball on the driveway. We had 10 floodlights. We played throughout the winter, no matter the weather. Single-digit weather, plowed the snow, threw salt on the driveway, melted the salt, 3-on-3 basketball under 10 floodlights, my brother and I and our friends. That's what we did throughout the winter in Rochester, and in the summertime I played baseball. Had a hard time talking to people, didn't know what to say to anybody unless they wanted to know about how the Baltimore Orioles were doing, right? So that was my childhood. When I was at school, I had a job. And the job, it wasn't a punishment, it was to clean the hallways after school. So inside the halls of Cardinal Mooney High School, myself and about at least 20 other kids, we would clean the halls and clean the rooms. I'd throw down the red stuff, and I'd push the broom, right? And I was always looking down, not just to keep a clean floor in a hallway. I cleaned the typing room, no, computer rooms, typing rooms. And he saw me one day, right inside that foyer, and he stopped me. And he engaged in dialogue and inquiry. He took the time, just like John McCollum did, right? And he came up and he said, why are you looking down so much? He had nicknames for everybody. He called me Coxie. Coxie, why are you looking down so much, right? And I kind of shrugged. He said, chin up, head up. He said, smile. There's a lot to smile about. Now, I didn't morph overnight and become this outgoing person, but you know what? As time went on, I became less shy And it's an honor to be standing here today to talk to you, to tell you this story. What I can tell you is, in my time, by connecting with Ed Natofsky in my 4 years at Cardinal Mooney High School, he taught me perseverance, sportsmanship, teamwork, and hustle. You know what's interesting? 40 years later, I graduated from high school 40 years ago, 40 years later, those same skills are needed to be a superintendent of schools, and I learned every one of them from him, and I'm very thankful for that. So, in closing, who are you practicing openness with, right? Who are you engaging in with dialogue and inquiry so you can knock down barriers and make connections so that you have choices? Those people are in this room, they're in the school, they're in the community. Thank you.